is super, super boring. So boring that while I'm reading it, I get so tired. Okay, so hopefully you can walk through this with me. I'm gonna take my evening medications and then we will start. Yes, babe. Do you wanna sit? Come here. Oh, yeah. Hey, girl. It's time for bedtime. Yes. Good job. First is my lysine. Magnesium glycinate. Then it's my allergy medication. Oh my god, this isn't working. Then it's my allergy medication, grapeseed oil, Lexapro, and Pepsid. This paper is called From Then to Now, the Development of Industrial Organizational Psychology in the United States. I'm not going to read it from the beginning because I already painstakingly read the beginning, so we're going to take it from, it's basically just detailing like the history of biopsych. So we did the first part of life and now we're going into World War I through the 1920s, Okay, here we go. My laptop is right here, so I'm reading. War was historically often turned out to be a catalyst of progress. This observation is true for psychology as well, because industrial psychology used the occasion of World War I to come out of the closet of academia. The wartime contribution of psychology has been comprehensively reported by Ferguson, Yerkes, Thorndike, Chapman, and Joachim, and Yerkes again. We rely heavily on those sources in describing World War I developments. In April 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany, a group of experimental psychologists were having its annual meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Upon hearing of the declaration of war, Yerkes, who was then president of the 25-year-old APA, which is the American Psychology Association, she's back, and several others quickly formed a psychology committee of the National Research Council with members representing the National Academy of Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the APA. The Army accepted their proposal that a psychological examining program of recruits be evaluated. This is still doing this. And Yerkes organized the Surgeon General section of psychology with the rank of major. Cool. Scott and Bingham, who were then faculty members of the Carnegie Institute of Technology, disagreed with the majority of the group. They believed that it would be more important to aid in the selection of officer personnel and that psychology should be placed under the Adjutant General, the Army's personnel officer, not within the Surgeon General's office. Scott persuaded Secretary of War Newton Baker to establish a psychological program in the Adjutant General's office, with himself and Bingham in charge. The Scott Bingham group was called the Committee on the academy as Yerke's group, with Scott rising into the rank of colonel and Bingham to lieutenant colonel. Their work was reported in the personnel systems of the United States Army. However, the SGO group under Yerkes received the larger share of publicity on the basis of the development of the Army Alpha and Beta group mental ability examinations. Results of using these two scales demonstrated the feasibility of large-scale selection testing and paved the way for larger expansion of the testing movement into government, industry, and education. On a darker note, this is a 33-page document, by the way. On a darker note, the misinterpretation of the results of intelligence testing also led to proposals that could inflict wrongs against certain ethnic subgroups. For example, Bingham's analysis of the Army data led him to conclude that race differences in intelligence existed, and to argue that if unchecked, they could lead to deterioration of the national talent pool. Yerkes in the foreword to Bingham's book noted ominously the menace of race deterioration. Those data were used in the debates of the early 1920s to try to reduce immigration from countries in which intelligence levels were lowered. This is just eugenics. Lesser known is Bingham's recantation, that's what I said, of those conclusions based on self-acknowledged errors of revocation, inability to combine the alpha and beta scores into a composite, and the recognition that both tests were verbally and culturally loaded. Duels in the popular press between Walter Lippmann and Louis Terman were another part of this debate. The issue, one of ethnic differences in general mental ability, is recurrent. Cool. It is cool, but a lot of words. Can we say it in less as this group laid a foundation for the young discipline that was firmly grounded in the basic psychological principles and based on collaborative research with industry. Many of its products and their students went on to expand the scope of IO Psych through academic training as well as thorough research. Okay, we're going into the next part. I'm going to skip the first paragraph because I think I already read this. We're talking about the Scott Company, and we're talking about the Great Depression. Key individuals in the Scott Company included Robert Clothier, I think he was mentioned earlier, who later became president of Rutgers University and co-authored a long-running book on personnel administration with Scott Beardsley. Whoa, unnamed Beardsley Rummel, who later became the treasurer of Macy's, R.H. Macy, and then an administrator of the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, New York, and who, as a member of F.D. Roosevelt's Brain Trust during the 1940s, devised the pay-as-you-go income tax system, and Arthur Kornhauser, who we heard of earlier, who later had distinguished teaching and a research career at the Chicago University and Wayne State University. After a short but brilliant existence, the Scott Company went out of business in the early 1920s. Was this a failure of IO Psych? No. Partly the firm was a victim of the Depression, but largely it was a victim of its own success, for its key personnel received so much favorable attention that they were lured away by attractive offers indicating that there were not enough IO psychologists to satisfy the demand for their services. In addition to the new jobs already noted for various staff, Scott returned to Northwestern University and accepted the presidency in 1921, a position that he held for 19 years. The other consulting organization founded in the wake of World War I was the Psychological Corporation. It was organized in 1921 by J. McKean Cattell, with 20 influential psychologists as directors and some 170 psychologists holding stock. Sokol described the organization as similar to a medieval guild, whereas Cattell himself used the term holding company for psychologists. Cattell was chairman of the board from this time to this time, and Henry C. Link was president. There were several reasons why the firm did not flourish under Cattell, but subsequent leadership by Bingham Link, Paula Gillies, and George Bennett led to a major role for the firm in disseminating and applying psychological techniques for some 50 years. Divisions of tests, counseling, industrial systematically examining applicants, engaging as consultants the famous behavioralist John B. Watson and the Scots Company's Beardsley Rumel. Those inquiries led to the establishment of the research section under L.J. O'Rourke in 1922, which has survived to this day under various designations. Job redesign, testing the tests against criteria, and cost-benefit analysis were all researched. However, obtaining the active support of top management, the labor unions, and the Civil Service Commission was always a crucial first step for O'Rourke. O'Rourke and Cavrock described the early projects undertaken by the research selection. Ernest Primov recently provided an extensive review of Civil Service Commission personnel activities from the late 1800s to World War II. In private industry, too, psychologists began to find employment. Harry Hebner, later of Syracuse University, was employed by the Kaufman department store in Pittsburgh during the early 1920s in the wake of the Carnegie Institute of Technology work on retail training. Rumel, as we have noted, went on from the Scots Company to Macy's, where Elsie O. Bregman had been evaluating clerical and sales personnel. We have a woman mention. This is woman number 2. Several life insurance firms decided to hire in-house psychologists. Marion Bills, a woman at Aetna, being a noteworthy example among manufacturing companies. Winter employed Link as a consultant, after which he worked with the U.S. Rubber Company, and Procter & Gamble hired H.G. In 1923 to do research on sales personnel following the demise of the Carnegie Institute of Technology program. Raise your hand if you are following. Anybody? No? Okay. I am surprisingly following. I should do this more often. This is like good behind it, okay? Okay. Procter & Gamble in particular has maintained a long tradition of hiring psychologists. Its staff later in the period, including Richard Urbrock, a Carnegie Tech product, and Paul Horst, a former Thurstone student. Urbrock, awful name, established the psychological research department at Procter & Gamble as part of the Industrial Relations Division in 1930. Vitalis, I know some of that name, briefly, and after him, nope, I skipped a whole part. Okay, briefly and after him, Sadie Meyer Shello, 4 woman mention, were employed by the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company during the 1920s. In 1920, there was still only a handful of IO psychologists. Terman, in analyzing the membership of APA, estimated the number to have been about 18, of whom only about 7 were clearly in industrial employment. There were few additional IO psychologists like A.G. Burt, whose principal employment was centered at a university. Their number increased later in the decade as employment opportunities expanded in industry, government, and consulting firms. However, judging from APA membership, we estimate that the total number of IO psychologists was still less than 50 by the decade's end. Psychologists with strong IO interest also were slowly being added to university faculties. Examples, in addition to those already cited, included Vitalis at the University of Pennsylvania, Miner at Ohio University, Kingsbury at the University of Chicago, Patterson at the University of Minnesota, Elton Mayo at Harvard University, and Fryer at NYU. Graduate training in IO psychology expanded slowly during the decade. The early history of the program at Ohio State University furnishes a typical example. Harold who are primarily academicians. Cool. Those factors also help spark increased attention to scientific and technical topics relevant to industrial psychology, both in applied settings and academia. In the discipline of psychology, behavioralism gave further impetus to objective studies of behavior and their practical applications, and also underscored the impact of environments on behavior. However, we should not overlook the fact that some of the thrust to take advantage of those opportunities came from within the field. Academics like Bingham, Cattle, Scott, Vitalis, and Yerkes were visionaries in seeing ways in which their fledgling discipline could be applied to industrial and national needs, and in identifying relevant subjects for scientific research and development. Such vision and initiative will continue to be worthy of emulation. Okay guys, so we are now going to be getting on to a different time period. So I believe I should hold off on reading, and maybe we'll do a little something, later. Okay. Bye bye bye. Thanks for being here with me, and I hope that you learned something